For today's project, I started with gluing the base parts together that I had to cut into 3 pieces because my 3D printer was too small to print the base in one sitting. The 3 parts took 98 hours to print on my Ender 3 Pro and it took half a kilo of PLA. After supergluing the FDM parts, I set my soldering iron to about 200 degrees Celsius and welded everything together, which in this case helped more to get rid of the seam lines than to increase the stability. I used a bunch of wood filler and spreaded it all over the base with a paintbrush. The paintbrush also helps with preserving a good texture. What also helps preserving a good texture, or to create a good texture, is if you take a piece of fabric and press it onto the wood filler. Afterwards, I went in with a mix of black and white acrylic color as a base color for the stony base. And without any sanding, the base was ready for the final paint job. But before we do that, let's prepare Wolverine as well. Wolverine's body was printed on my Elegoo Saturn, which took 8 individual prints, 750 grams of resin and about 60 hours of printing time. I took my water bucket Sandy and started sanding, filling and gluing together the parts. This time I glued together all of the parts before painting, except the forearms with the claws and the head. This way it's easier to get rid of all the seam lines. However, painting and masking will be more tricky than if all the parts would be glued together after painting. With Aves epoxy sculpt and sculpting tools, I slowly filled all the seam lines. And with the sculpting tools, I tried to recreate the original texture of the sculpt. Then I base coated Wolverine with a rattle can primer in my very professional cardboard paint booth. By the way, this model was sculpted by Julem Adrian. A link to his ArtStation profile is in the description. After applying the primer, you can perfectly see all the imperfections, so I went in with my X-Acto knife and small files to get rid of the remaining support remnants. And Wolverine received his yearly dental care checkup. And then it was time for painting. I started with pale flesh for his skin. Afterwards, I used blue, red and yellow to tint the pale flesh. But here I learned that it does make sense to apply a layer of varnish after every color you paint. I didn't do that here, and since the color was not fully dried after the different steps, the red basically soaked into the previous layers and Wolverine looked like he had a too long nap on the tanning bed. So I had to reset back to 0 with pale flesh, and now I applied a layer of varnish after every color. But now, before the tinting with yellow, blue and red, I used dark flesh tone to darken the skin a bit. I also used my airbrush set to a very low pressure to do some sprinkling. And then to tone that sprinkling down, I went back in with pale flesh. And then I went back in with yellow, red and blue washes. And don't forget to varnish it after every coat. I then painted the mouth and gums with red mixed with a bunch of glaze medium. And after I was satisfied with that, I used Ghost Gray to paint the eyes. Then I used a mix of water, khaki and scarlet red to paint the lips. Wolverine's teeth were painted with bone white. And then I put the head to the side and started with his body. For the yellow parts of his suit, I used Model Air Yellow Ochre. To accentuate the muscle striations, I went in with brown pastel powder. And when you have a little bit too much of brown here and there, you can then tone it down with using the original yellow ochre color. For all the brown parts, I used burnt umber. Then I used black pastel color for shading on the brown parts. And then I finished the shoes with Model Air Black. After I also painted the arms with pale flesh, I used a khaki wash because the pale flesh really is pale. If you ever need to paint a pig, this is the color you need. With brown pastel, I shaded all the muscle separations on the arms. Then I checked whether the skin color of the head sculpt fits together with the skin color of the arms. Then I went in with blue pastel powder to shade the veins. Afterwards, I started to paint the upper torso with burnt umber with the paintbrush because I was too lazy for masking. But after the second coat with the paintbrush, I realized I'm not done with the second coat and need to go for a third or even a fourth one. And then I eventually masked it and airbrushed it. Then I trimmed the black lines on the upper torso. And here you can see the advantage of using a coat of varnish after every color. I got a tiny bit of black on the yellow part of the suit. Without varnish, it could happen that you tint the yellow so much that you can't clean it up anymore. However, when you have a coat of varnish, you can simply brush the color away with a paintbrush and water, or you can even use a thinner and a Q-tip without destroying the yellow part. I did a little bit of shading on the torso as well. And then I revisited the head sculpt. Apparently Wolverine was a big smoker, correct me if I'm wrong, so I used watered down burnt umber to tint the teeth a bit. Then I took the magic dough, masked off the skin parts and the eyes and painted the head sculpt yellow. With the paintbrush and black I painted the rest of the head. I then went back to the suit and painted the pants with burnt umber as well. And the belt was painted with Scarlet Red, followed by dry brushing with Model Air Red, because the Scarlet Red is a bit too much on the pinkish side. Then I painted the forearms with burnt umber, did some shading with pastel color, trimming with black, and gunmetal silver where Wolverine's claws come out. Let me know how these are called if you know it. And then I used masking fluid to mask everything except the claws. Then I painted the claws with green stuff chrome. If you want to see me paint a whole statue with green stuff chrome, check out my Silver Surfer video at the end card of this video. And after a bit of cleanup, the forearms were done. Then it was time for the final touch-ups on the head. I used blue and green pastel powder to create a 5 o'clock shadow and trimmed the mask with black. Because the teeth were a bit too brown after the burnt umber, I went in with bone white again, and the head was done. With a big makeup brush, I dry brushed Wolverine's arm hair. Lastly, I used gunmetal to paint his belt buckle, and then the body was done. I then went over the whole base and made a wash with watered down earth color that I spread all over the base and dabbed away the excess with a paper towel. Afterwards I thinned down black mixed with yellow olive, and this time I didn't use a paper towel to dab the excess away, but I just let it drip off and let the excess dry in all of the crevices. And after the wash was dried, it looked like this. Could you tell that this once was an ugly FDM print? The final step was Green Stuff's snow powder that I tried for the first time. You simply mix it with water and some PVA or wood glue until you have your desired texture. And then I spread a couple of layers onto the base. And once the base was dry, I also made the boots a bit snowy. And while we are at the boots, I thought they looked a little bit too clean for Wolverine being wandering around in the snow, so I used the earth color again and dry brushed a bit of dirt to the boots. I then glued together all the pieces with hot glue and called it good.